Tonight we're talking about poverty and inequality. This is part of our Policy and Practice mini-series on priorities for the new UK government, what the government is doing, perhaps what the government ought to be doing. And today we're going to be talking about poverty and inequality, two very key issues that I think have become much more salient in recent years with the cost of living crisis and the pandemic and welfare reforms and many other things that we're going to talk about tonight that have affected the position of people at the bottom of the economic ladder. And we'd like to talk today about what the new government is planning to do, what the new government has done so far, and what more we think the government should be doing over the next few years on this agenda. And I'm really pleased to be joined by three fantastic speakers and experts on the topic. At the end there is Mike Brewer. Mike is the Interim Chief Executive of the Resolution Foundation, visiting professor at the Department of Social Policy at the LSE. He's got a wide range of interests in inequality and income and wealth, in the labour market, the tax and benefits system, previously worked at the Institute for Fiscal Studies and at the Treasury. On my left here is Sara Ogilvie. She's Director of Policy, Rights and Advocacy at the Child Poverty Action Group and previously worked at the Trade Union Congress and Liberty. And in the middle there is Jitendra. She's Principal Policy Advisor on Care and Families at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, and her areas of expertise include care and energy policy, regulation, social security. She's previously worked at the Citizens Advice Bureau and the Trussell Trust. And besides all that, is also a trustee of Quaker Social Action. So three fantastic experts today. The format is that each of them is going to give some introductory remarks for a few minutes, and then I'm going to ask them a few questions, and then we will open the floor for questions from all of you. And I just need to mention before we start that this whole session, including the Q&A, is being recorded. It's going to be posted online on our department's website. It's going to be on our YouTube channel, and there will be a podcast after the event. If you speak, you will be heard in the recording. If you don't speak, you will not be heard in the recording. And we will let you know when the recording is available. And we hope that you might wish to share it with your networks once you watch it. Without further ado then, we'll get started tonight. And I've asked Mike to kick us off with a few opening remarks. Over to you.
Thank you very much. I work with the Resolution Foundation, which is a think tank in London, economic think tank, which campaigns for low to middle income households to see rises in their living standards. But I must say it's bringing out the inner academic in me. I wasn't academic for 10 years before going to Resolution Foundation. So I get to start by giving us the kind of big picture on the background to where we are now, where we are on poverty and inequality. I would say that the last couple of decades there has not been one where in the UK poverty and inequality have been on the rise. It's been a story of actually not much change in the shape of the income distribution, and that's what's measured by inequality, and that's what's captured by poverty. Instead, there's been a much more serious problem, just an absence of income growth overall across the income distribution. So measures of relative poverty in the UK have been essentially unchanged over the past 20 years, about 21-22%. And the Gini coefficient, a measure of inequality across the whole distribution, is basically wobbling around 0.38, 0.39. It was a bit higher before the financial crisis and fell during the crisis, but no real trends. And so I would say what's really been striking about the last 20 years has been the absence of income growth. Income's at the 10th percentile of the income distribution, so 10% of the way up from the bottom, grew by just 7% in the past 20 years. 7% over 20 years. In the previous decade, they grew by about 20%. That's the real story of the last 20 years. So does that mean we could be relaxed? If poverty and inequality are not growing, does that mean there's no problem? No, not really. Two big reasons. First of all, if you think that inequality is harmful, then it's the level you should care about and not the rate of change. And the UK is an unequal country. We've got basically probably the second highest rate of income inequality in Europe, behind, it fluctuates who's the worst in Europe. It's sort of Bulgaria or Lithuania or one of these Central Eastern European countries. And amongst the G7, we're second worst only after the US. So we are a high inequality country. And if inequality is bad for us, then every year it stays high is another year that it's harming social outcomes, bad for our health, bad for trust and cohesion, and possibly even bad for economic growth. So you should care about inequality even when it's not rising. What about poverty? Well, I would say that those relatively high rates of poverty, combined with a lack of income growth over the previous 2 decades, it put low-income households in a really bad position when we got hit by those two big shocks at the start of this decade. Pandemic, cost of living, double whammy. So let me talk you through the impact they had on people in different parts of the income distribution. So I mean, I look at the room and I see so many young people who, of course, were at school during the pandemic, but those of us who were a bit older in the pandemic, it had very unequal impacts on family finances. So better off households just saved in record amounts, paid off their debts, saved in huge amounts, paid off the mortgages, because they weren't spending any money, because there was much fewer opportunities to spend money. If you're towards the bottom end of the income distribution, you still had to carry on spending, you still got to pay rent and buy food and stuff, and if anything, some of the essential costs became more expensive during the pandemic, particularly during lockdowns or when there was social distancing. So the pandemic made us more unequal. And then we went straight in from that into the cost of living crisis. And the cost of living crisis, it's easier to understand why that impact might be unequal. The cost of living crisis was rooted in the price of essentials, in energy and food, and afterwards housing, and those make up a higher fraction of poor people's budget than better off people, and so it naturally had more impact on low-income households, and that's before we think about the fact that they had fewer buffers, lower financial resilience. And that's why we've got sort of other measures of deprivation and people experiencing difficulties like food insecurity or material deprivation. Those are at really high levels right now because of that double whammy of the pandemic and cost of living crisis. So where are we so far with this government? I mean, not that far, I'm going to say. Today we had the Prime Minister give a bit more detail about what he understands it meaning by their drive for growth. So they said in the election campaign that one of their key missions was to go for growth, and today they've said, well, what that means in reality is they're going to target a measure of income known as real household disposable income. They're also going to look at GDP per capita. And they want GDP per capita to grow in every region of the country. That's their sense in which they want growth to be shared. So that's good. I mean, I think it's the first time that any government has put living standards right at the front of what they want to achieve. But a major drawback of both of these measures, this real household disposable income as well as GDP per capita, is they tell us what happens to total incomes or average incomes, and they completely ignore what's going on across the distribution. And this is really important. Some modelling that we did over the summer suggested that if the government sort of stick with the previous government's plans for taxes and social security benefits, and if we can't get any kind of growth in earnings, then it looks like incomes for low-income households are set to fall in real terms over this Parliament. As I say, there's room to change that. Policies can change, the economic environment can change, but what we thought in the summer was that the inheritance this government had, weak growth in earnings, rising rents, and various social security policies, which are in effect taking income away from low-income families, meant that the bottom half of the distribution may see their incomes fall in real terms. And then just on the budget, which only a few weeks ago, going into that, the Prime Minister said that those with the broadest shoulders should bear the heaviest burdens. And in the budget, we saw the government implement their manifesto commitments to abolish non-dom status, raise taxes on carried interest, put VAT on private schools, and capital gains and inheritance tax also went up in various ways. So those are all measures that bear down very heavily on better off households, and I think that means that the PM's promise was met, even though the budget did also cut winter fuel payments for older people, and the government remains committed to making savings in some incapacity benefits. Do I see a different approach to inequality and poverty from this government? I mean, probably not. So yes, it's true the budget did bear down heavily on the very rich. But actually, if you look back at what the previous Conservative governments did, they also saw that it was sometimes politically expedient to raise lots of money from very rich people. They don't get much sympathy in the press, right? And the reforms in the budget to inheritance tax and capital gains tax, the two ones which are really targeted at very well-off people, they were not motivated rhetorically by the state of inequality in the UK. Instead, the Chancellor described them as being technical corrections to our tax system to correct for the fact that at the moment certain bits of income are taxed at different rates to others, or certain bits of wealth taxed at lower rates to others. And it was removing those supposed unfairnesses and inefficiencies rather than a passionate cry to reduce inequality. So I think we've got a government committed to raising living standards, at least on paper. They're saying the right things about that needing to be widely shared, but it's certainly not yet making a strong anti-inequality argument. And I would also say it's not really going out of its way yet to make an anti-poverty argument, but I'm really excited to see what Sara has to make of that.
Thank you very much, Mike. And as you said, over now to Sara.
Thank you. Apologies for being late as well. I made that mistake that no one who calls himself a Londoner should make, which is that I thought, oh, it's raining, I'll hop on the bus, rather than it's raining, do not hop on the bus, whatever you do. So apologies for that. I mean, in terms of what the government is doing on child poverty so far and what its policies are, I mean, a bit of a glib response to that would be, I don't think they've got any yet, but that's a little bit superficial, and it possibly wouldn't be take up my 5-minute slot either. So let's do a bit of background talk before we kind of think about where they're at. So there are 4.3 million kids in the UK living in poverty, and that's a record high. And whenever I start talks like this, I always think it's worthwhile really reflecting on what that means for those kids and for their families. So it can be about a parent who's going hungry because they've decided to give their child a hot meal that night rather than have something for themselves. It could be about a child knowing that's what their parent has done and really worrying about that and being upset and stressed about it. At this time of year, it could be kids not being able to go to Christmas parties, not being able to buy presents, about that worry about how a family is going to provide a Christmas meal. You know, this time of the year when so many people are celebrating and having a great time, actually being scared about what that means for how you're going to get to the end of the month with some money left in your bank account to pay for the bills. And that's kind of a really horrible way to think that kids are going through their childhood. But also I think it speaks to kind of the social isolation that comes for it, as well as from the kind of the deprivation that children and families face. But it can also be a matter of life and death. We know that in areas of higher deprivation, there is lower life expectancy, there are higher rates of infant mortality. We know that the consequences of growing up in poverty stay with you for your whole life. That could be about your physical health, it could be about your mental health. And the stat that always kind of still really floors me is the fact that still in 2024 in the UK, the strongest predictor of how a child will succeed at school is their family income. And that just can't be right. I think it's worth thinking about what child poverty is, as well as the impact it has. And you know, Mike mentioned at the start that poverty hasn't increased too much in the UK over the past decade or so, but actually child poverty has risen. And some of that, of course, is because it's about families who were in poverty before they had children. But actually a lot of it is related to the fact that you have a kid. And if you have a kid, like, they cost money. You know, you have to buy them food, they need clothes, they might need a room to live in, so your housing costs are going to be more than they were previously. It's about the fact that you probably have to look after them, and you maybe even want to spend some time with them. So that might be about childcare costs that you didn't have before. It might be, if you're a parent, you've got to take part-time work or flexible work over a job where there's career progression for you, or where you can work more hours and earn more. So it's kind of that combination of factors that at the very moment in your life where you need more money, your ability to go out and work to earn that is reduced. And then there's also just this kind of critical fact that ultimately, even if you are working part-time, full-time, your salary is going to stay the same no matter how many kids you have. And, you know, as much as I would like my boss to give me more money for having kids, actually, you know, my colleagues who work just as hard as I do probably wouldn't be happy going along with that. So that's just something that's never going to change in the policy landscape. And I think you have to really think about that when you're working out where this government needs to get to on child poverty. It's also worth thinking about the characteristics of children and families that you find in poverty, because I think that will help you get to some of the solutions that you need as well. So yeah, about 30% of kids in the UK live in poverty. The bit of London where I live, that goes up to 43%. But if you're a black kid, you are 51% of black children are living in poverty. If you're a child who lives in a family where you or someone else has a disability, it's 36%. So you can see that those additional factors, those risk factors that make you more likely to be living in poverty, probably also speak to the solutions that we need to find to it. You also need to think a bit before you arrive in the solutions about why things have got worse in recent years for child poverty. And in about the past decade or so, looking at different measures, about 700,000 more kids are in poverty than they were in 2010. And that's not just one factor, a combination of things. But if you look at austerity, about £50 billion worth annually has been taken out of the social security system since 2010. So that is obviously going to have an impact on families. But also some of the policies that took money out of family incomes from austerity, it's not just that families were affected by them, but they directly targeted families with children. And you can see that in the two-child limit in particular. A measure in the social security system that doesn't affect anybody other than families with more than 2 children. Housing, of course, as well. I think Mike mentioned it briefly. Housing costs quite a lot more money than it did 10, 20 years ago, and that's a huge cost factor for families. And again, we just come back to this point that, there is more that you can do by working. It does make a bit of a difference if you can work, but actually almost 70% of families where a kid is living in poverty are in a working family, so at least one parent is in work. So we can see that employment just isn't actually the solution to getting out of poverty that sometimes you might think, understandably, that it is. So what for this government to do? They have launched a child poverty task force and said that they're going to be publishing a child poverty strategy, probably in spring leading to summer. I heard yesterday possibly summer leading to autumn, so we'll see where we get to with that. So I think, there is an intention there. Based on the conversations that we have with ministers, secretaries of states, with officials, special advisors, I don't actually for a second doubt the good faith of that intention. I think they want to reduce and end child poverty here in the UK. But actually you have to take the actions that are going to live up to that aspiration. And warm words won't actually keep families warm in winter. So I think, through the course of this winter, things are still going to be really, really tough for families. I think hope is pretty low. And that strategy, when it is published, it needs to look at how do you generate more income for families. Because one thing that we see in history, that's a bit of a grand statement, but the evidence shows us that if you give families money, if you increase their income, that leads to a reduction in child poverty. So that is what the previous Labour government did from 1997 onwards, and we saw that 700,000 reduction in child poverty. Even if you look during the pandemic, the £20 uplift, that wasn't a measure that was targeted at families specifically. So you only got the same amount if you were maybe a single person or if you were a family with a couple of kids. But nonetheless, during that period, we saw about 300,000 more kids lifted out of poverty, and when that £20 was taken away, the same number fell back into poverty. There are a lot of factors around COVID that you've got to think about when you're reflecting on that, but we see that pattern of if you give money to families, it makes a difference here. So it's, in a sense, it's quite a nice policy area to work in. But what that means is government does need to spend money on it, right? And this is one of the challenges we're facing at the moment. The government is concerned about the fiscal situation, so when they're thinking about the child poverty strategy, they want solutions that perhaps don't cost as much money as are going to be needed. But in the social security system, you kind of just got to bite the bullet on that one. So we would say scrap the 2-child limit, look at increasing the rate of benefits because they're very, very low, even for people who can get them. You can include in that child benefit, and obviously that goes to a much wider range of people and would, not just target those living in family, but would lift other people a little bit higher up than they're doing right now, but comes with a bigger price ticket. And then free school meals is something we're thinking about as well. So obviously income matters, but government can play a role in reducing costs for families too. And then free school meals is a very particular one that affects families with children. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Over to you, Abby.
Brilliant, thanks so much. So I was going to set the scene for how terrible things are at the moment, but I think both of my co-panelists have done quite a good job. But I guess just a few more statistics to throw at you. I don't think we should understate sort of how much this government has a sort of generational opportunity and an urgent need to tackle poverty and economic insecurity. So the Joseph Rowntree Foundation does kind of regular reporting on sort of poverty levels, and destitution, and we found that 1 million children in 2022 were in destitution before this government took office, and our latest data shows that the financial situation of low-income households has remained unchanged from 6 months ago. So, the question that Keir Starmer, if you saw his speech this morning, posed to people, that the thing we will be judged on is the classic Reagan comment, do you feel better off now than you did 4 years ago? So far, the change is very limited, if any. And therefore, it's right that I think as you were saying, Mike, the change in tone from the government to focus more on living standards, to focus more on disposable income, absolutely meets that challenge. But there is a big question about how you actually deliver that, because that requires big policy change, funding, and a real reprioritization of how government works. And it is really important. The winning of this is crucial to whether people trust government or not. We have a huge problem now where people just completely mistrust the government's ability to do anything. And so, and the cost of living crisis we saw in America was a big part of the kind of, re-rise of Trump there. So it feels like it's a really crucial question here. Sarah's talked a lot about some of the stuff I was going to mention around family. So I'm going to focus a bit more on care and think about why we think, why care is important for poverty. And I think one of the key reasons is that if you have caring demands, as you said, Sara, it's very hard to work. Care and work don't mix, and it's a very gendered problem. It's increasingly, and has been in the past, a racialized problem. But this is why sort of labour market policy and good work and helping people sustain good work is just so crucial. And therefore, I feel quite optimistic, actually. Obviously, sort of politics is tricky and funding is tricky, but I feel optimistic when I was reading the government's sort of employment rights bill document, and I felt really like, if you are a progressive and you care about, income inequality and good work, then this kind of work, this kind of document is exactly what we need to start pushing back against the sort of erosion of worker power that we've seen in our labour market. And so, yeah, I felt personally that was a nice day as a policy person. I enjoyed reading that document. So a key source of insecurity in work is, as I said, the inability to balance work and care. And we can see this in the groups of families who are most likely to fall into poverty. So lone parents and larger families are disproportionately at risk of poverty because it's harder to sustain and maintain good work when there's just one of you in a household, or there are more mouths to feed and therefore children to care for, and children to care for. We did some research last year which looked at understanding society to sort of rerun numbers on what's called the motherhood penalty, so what is the value of lost wages. But we also looked at social caregivers because more and more as we get older, we aren't just going to be looking for our children, we are going to be looking for our spouses, looking after our spouses and our parents. And we found that for both child and unpaid social caregivers, you have a significant pay penalty in the year after you start caring, and also 6 years after. So there's a really big economic insecurity there that's created purely because you have caring demands, and that's generally because you either reduce your hours worked or you leave work altogether. Or if you're kind of in that unpaid social care cohort, it's often because you take early retirement, because that's the sort of profile of those people. And people lose thousands, so it's a pretty big pay hit on people, and unsurprisingly, women face the heaviest burden because in our society, the caring demands are still very gendered. Even though more men are caring, women are both working more and caring more. That's some research continues to show. So, what do we need to tackle all of this? I think the labour market is definitely somewhere where the government has lots of levers and things that they can do. So one really important way that we can help families make more genuine choices about work and care, so whether they work and pay for care or whether they leave work and do care themselves, is ensuring that within your job you have the ability to take paid time off. And the last government put into place something called carer leave. You'd think that'd be paid, right? But actually, it was 5 days of unpaid care. And for some people, that's great. But for many people on very low incomes, or even just low incomes, the idea of taking unpaid leave is just unthinkable for them. And then when you look at parents, maternity leave and maternity pay are insufficient, we know. I mean, paternity leave and paternity pay are just like a complete joke. And shared parental leave is just so underutilized, partly because, again, people don't, fathers don't want to take leave from their spouses or their partners, and that's how shared parental leave works. You basically take leave from your partner, and actually what we need is dedicated paternity leave for fathers. So that's support in work, and we also know that flexible work is really important. When we speak to people with caring demands, the thing they always want more than anything else, actually more than paid care leave, is just work that's flexible, that having power over their shifts, being able to speak to their employer if something's come up, real flexibility. And then actually one of the other crucial ways to make that choice sort of not coerced and as free as possible is to have a paid care system, so a paid childcare system and a paid social care system that really works. And we know that care is increasingly a public service because the government has just pumped lots of money into the childcare system, but it's not regulated, designed, or indeed funded as one. And I'll sort of draw on both childcare and adult social care, but across both we need a proper funding settlement, which clearly speaks to need and also kind of income, making sure that the poorest who draw on that care are getting the most support. That's not really the case. It's sort of the case in adult social care, but the means test is just so ungenerous that actually most people don't even get support. And in childcare, actually the wealthier families actually get the most support. We need to really think about the workforce. Again, it's a public service, but the workforce they don't look like a public service. They're some of the lowest paid workers in our society. The Resolution Foundation did a very good report on that last year, which I really loved. And they're very under-unionised, again, minoritized. Pay is a really key sticking point, but conditions are too. The government is going to change, hopefully, some of that in adult social care, but that's still quite a way away. And then finally, there's a kind of a techie question about regulation. So who should deliver these services? What should we expect from them? What is the role of local authorities? Who runs this system? Who governs it? Who regulates it? And honestly, these are all really open questions, and the government has made a commitment in their manifesto to create a national care service. And when I speak to officials, to special advisors, to ministers, they don't actually know what that is. They don't have a clear vision of that, and that's difficult because we will need to be delivering it quite soon. And just my final thought, and I guess to sort of challenge what you said a little bit, Mike, is yes, the pandemic and the cost of living crisis were the two most recent shocks to household finances. But as you said, Sara, before that, a huge chunk of the benefits bill was cut by the coalition government and the government after. So actually, people have been living in a sort of household income permacrisis, many people for a long time. And I know this because my first job out of uni was at the Trussell Trust, which is a food bank charity where I would go out to food banks and you see people in the most dire situations. People haven't eaten for days. People who, just as Sara said, have had to go hungry for days and days and days to feed their family. And so benefits is where we need to be looking, I think, first and foremost. And the Joseph Rowntree Foundation has been doing lots of work calling for an essentials guarantee, which basically means that universal credit or your benefits need to reflect at the basic level just the cost of essentials. And currently they don't. And actually when you go to speak to people about that, they're quite shocked because people don't realise that actually the level at which benefits are set has nothing to do with costs. It's the inflation can go up by 10% and the actual, unless a politician kind of steps in, the basic rate of benefits won't change. There's no independent setting of that amount, and therefore people go hungry. It's not such a surprise. I'll stop there.
Thank you all very much indeed. Lots of food for thought there, and I'm really looking forward to our discussion. So I'm going to start with a couple of questions of my own before we open to the audience. And I can see at least one student here from my Politics of Inequality class, and I'm going to start with the question that I gave them in their first seminar of the year, which is that you've talked a lot about reasons to care about poverty, and you've talked a lot about what's happening at the bottom. Do you think that we should be concerned about inequality, or should we just be concerned about what's happening at the bottom and not worry about differences between the top and the bottom? And maybe we'll just go in order. I'll start with you, Mike. How would you respond to that challenge? Is it poverty or is it inequality that we should be worried about?
Sorry if I nick all the good points.
Specifically last.
But it is where I did write a book a few years ago. What do we know? What do we know? And what should we do about inequality? So why should we care about inequality? I I think of sort of static reasons and dynamic reasons. That's too economisty, isn't it? So there are people who argue that inequality is bad for social outcomes. There are people who argue inequality is bad for economic outcomes, and there are people who argue that inequality is bad for social mobility. Those are the three big reasons. When I say argue, I mean present evidence and do research showing that. So the argument that inequality is bad for social outcomes is most clearly associated with the Spirit Level book from more than 15 years ago. Richard Wilkinson and I'm afraid I've forgotten his collaborator, even though the name will pick it. Thank you. Yes, Kate. That's right, Kate. Who just showed that the level of inequality in a country or a state or a region or a city is correlated with crime, with poor health outcomes, with trust, with social cohesion, and there are various mechanisms that they theorise for why that happens. There was a kind of big deal about a decade ago when even the IMF said that inequality might be bad for growth. Now, admittedly, this is more towards the kind of Latin American levels of inequality, which are much higher than the UK, being a sort of signal of an economy that's very fragile and unstable, and they show that in turn might lower growth. But I think the bigger one is the link between inequality and social mobility. So even when people say they don't think inequality is a bad thing, they tend to think that social mobility is a good idea. So social mobility being the idea that where you get to in life is not determined by what your parents were doing. So more people are happy with this idea of meritocracy, high social mobility, than are about saying inequality is a bad thing. But high levels of inequality make social mobility worse, lower social mobility. They make it more important for your parental background. And there's part of it, I'm sorry, I'm going to lecture mode, aren't I? Part of it is just a kind of mechanical effect that the more inequality there is, the more you stretch out the income distribution, the harder it is to get from down there to up there. Like the rungs of the ladder are bigger, more, so it's just harder. But there's another one that the more inequality there is, the more particularly parents do things to protect their children from this unequal society. So if you can see that the labour market is very unequal, if you can see that the education system has lots of high stakes, really important exams, then naturally as a parent you do what you can to allow your children to thrive. And all the things that parents do to let their children thrive are so much easier if you have money. And so inevitably you end up reducing social mobility, making parental background more important the more inequality there is. So that's my lecturer answer to why we should care about inequality as well as poverty.
Great. Maybe I'll just invite either of you to respond to that, if you like.
Yes, what do I think? So it's kind of two reflections that are way less thought through than yours, Mike, sorry. So I think the first thing is, I think we have very deeply held views, and the public have very deeply held views about fairness. And I think inequality is a really interesting one because you can ask someone, it's not fair, or do you agree that it's not fair that, a child born in this area with this family background has very different outcomes than a child born in this family background in this area? That's how a lot of the kind of opportunity mission, this government's opportunity mission, is being framed by sort of life chances and the kind of distribution of life chances. And then you can also ask the same person, and they will agree, and you can ask that same person, if you have spent your whole life amassing wealth, do you think you should be able to pass it down to your children? And the same person will wholeheartedly say yes to both. And so I think inequality is interesting in that sense because I think it does, I think more so than poverty, where I think you can, I think it is slightly easier with poverty to get past sort of individualizing sort of narratives of it and sort of cut through into some consensus of, at least at the very lowest level, material poverty, extreme deprivation. The government has a crucial role to play to solve that. I think it's slightly harder on the inequality side. So that's just adding a little bit of sort of political economy with that. And then my second thought is just thinking about care. One really interesting thing, the reason why I'm really interested in regulation is that my previous role was working at Citizens Advice on many different things, but then I found myself working on energy, thinking it would be a very boring beat. And then the market crashed, which was really interesting because actually one of the really interesting things in that space was that the regulation of that market was really poor. And when you look at the care system, it's actually very similar. And you have actually you have a very unequal system in care, where you have some providers that have huge amounts of, or backed by huge amounts of wealth from overseas often, that are run in very sort of untransparent ways. And then you have lots of small providers that are, kind of quite sort of ramshackle and are not able to get by. So it's a slightly different. When I think about inequality, I think in the care system and in the childcare system, there are growing monopolies and a need for the regulation of the wealth that's backing these providers, and government is basically not willing to intervene in those markets, because those bigger sort of financialized providers make up more and more of the number of places, basically. So that's just a slight other way of thinking about it.
Another way of answering the question is to avoid it a bit. And you can speak about income inequality, which it was clearly a question about, but I think when you look at poverty statistics, you can see inequality between all those different groups. Sometimes it's protected characteristics in particular, so those stats about children who grow up in a family where someone has a disability, children who grow up in a black family or who are from a minoritized ethnic community, and the rates are much, much higher than for white children, for children who grow up in a household where someone isn't disabled, and that kind of replicates across lots of different patterns. And I think sometimes poverty gives you an insight into the different inequalities that exist across society, and we can have policies that target the poverty bit of it. So you can give families where someone has a disability more money to pay for the extra costs that come with that. But there are also other factors related to different kinds of support that society probably isn't giving those families, be that the level of social care that they need, whether that's about their opportunities in the employment market, or how you go about life in our social and economic model. So I think if you're looking at poverty, it's a good clue to some of the other problems that we have.
Thank you very much. So my next question is for anyone, so please feel free to jump in. You all, I think, one of the themes of all three of your opening remarks was about the rise, if you like, of in-work poverty. So 20 years ago, we used to talk about unemployment. Now we talk a lot about in-work poverty. And one of the other things that's changed has been the minimum wage. And I noticed none of you mentioned the minimum wage. Yeah, I think from April, the minimum wage is set to go up. I believe it's going to be about £23,000 a year. And I think we can see the minimum wage as being one of the real success stories, I would say, in this country of anti-poverty policy. And I would like to just invite you to reflect on what do you think has led to, maybe you'll disagree with me, which is fine, but assuming you agree with me, what has led to the success of the minimum wage as an anti-poverty policy lever that explains why that's different to other policy areas that you've talked about? I'll let anyone jump in on that.
I mean, I would look at it from the other side and think about, obviously increasing minimum wage is really, really important. Anything you can do to increase how much money people have is really great. But when you look at it in relation to poverty, we use a relative poverty measure more often than not. So it's kind of trying to understand how people are able to afford what other people in society can have according to the accepted standards of living. So, everybody's income increasing, then kind of, you can see that might not always make an impact on the poverty measures. But for parents in particular, the minimum wage increases are really important. But if you can only work a certain number of hours and that increase is only going to be £1 or £2 or even £3 or £4 per hour, actually that's not going to make a critical difference to you. And also, often for families to be able to get out of poverty, you need more than one person in that family to be working. And actually, in a lot of families, the second earner, that person who you need to get into work, they're going to be earning the minimum wage, but actually the person that they're in a relationship with is already earning much more than that anyway. So the difference that person can make it isn't going to be critical.
I think I can also draw on what Avi was saying in their opening remarks as well, when you were talking about how the 2010s saw what we call austerity, benefits being cut back. That's true. It also saw increases in minimum wage, and it also saw record levels of employment, and it's the kind of those two things basically offset each other to give the fact that I said at the very beginning that sort of at the bottom of the income distribution, not much growth over the decade. So if for those families who were heavily reliant on benefits, then yes, the 2010s was awful. Many benefits were cut back or didn't keep up with inflation. But we did see record high employment rates, at least before the pandemic, and changes in hourly wages. Hourly wages changed in a way that were inequality reducing. So much higher growth in wages at the bottom of the wage distribution compared to the top of the wage, in part driven by the minimum wage. Why the minimum wage is so popular is a very interesting question, and not one definitely more for the politics students. I think. I mean, the UK's path towards having a high minimum wage was kicked off by George Osborne when he was Chancellor. I mean, he is like Mr. Austerity, Mr. Bash the poor, cut public spending, and then in 2015 or whatever it was, he suddenly decided, no, I'm going to whack up the minimum wage and put us on a path where the bite of the minimum wage is now one of the highest internationally, and with widespread political approval. So there's a political story there and how they made the minimum wage very popular. But I would say it's not a particularly good anti-poverty policy, and especially not a good anti-child poverty policy. Sara is really sort of explaining how child poverty tends to occur. It occurs not because of low income. It occurs because your income doesn't match your needs, and even a high minimum wage is still not going to match your needs if you've got 2 or 3 children and if you're trying to pay rent in the private rented sector. So child poverty is an issue that occurs because we don't give people enough support for their additional costs, and there's only so much you can do with a high minimum wage.
Yeah, I guess just to build on what others have said, I mean, it's really interesting when you speak to social care workers, some of the lowest paid workers in the system, and it's such a hard job, the pay's terrible, and you ask, why are you still working there? I mean, many of them have gone to work for Tesco or something where the pay is better and the conditions are better. But for a lot of them, it's actually not pay, but it's conditions that matter. Many of them have flexibility, they have a good relationship with their employer, they have power over shifts. So actually, it's a broader, how do workers respond to, changes. Pay is one thing, but conditions are another really important one. I'd also add to Mike's comments on child poverty. As I said, it's part of it is pay not meeting the cost of needs. It's also just how much pay. How much can you really work if you're a single mum of 3 kids? Probably not that much. And we did some analysis to look at whether there's the increased childcare subsidies which the government is giving people for second earners, for various complicated reasons to do with universal credit that I won't get into now. But if your partner is in work and you are not in work but you want to take on work, the cost of childcare, housing costs, and the cost of the universal credit taper basically means that it's not worth you working. You might as well just stay at home. Your labour is better spent staying at home, which is, I mean, that's just a shame, right? It's one of the reasons why our female sort of employment rate is probably not as high as it should be. So. Yeah, not sure if I answered the question, but just some other thoughts.
Thank you all very much indeed. I'm now going to open the floor to questions. So I'll try and take questions in groups of 2 or 3. We don't have a roving mic, so if I can just ask you to speak up so the room can hear you. And I'll start with anyone who'd like to start us off. Yeah, off you go.
Right, hi. I think my question is about the link between inequality actually leading to poverty. Young people, particularly in fiscal males, they're more likely to be persistently absent, more likely to be excluded from school, which means they then tend to leave school with worse grades and enter the workforce at a very lower rate. So, which one do you think we ought to be tackling for? Is it this inequality that's just driving worse, economic and educational outcomes for them, or is it poverty that ought to be the government's priority?
Any other questions I can take at the moment? Yes, on the right there.
Yeah, a lot of the discussion about poverty and inequality concerns distribution and the use of income. I just wonder if there's anything that's being developed that enables the public, or the politicians even, to understand just what effect cuts in public services have had in terms of people in poor circumstances, dependent on public services in many cases, and limited in choice as far as public services is concerned.
Thanks. I think we'll take those two actually, and then we'll come back because those are two somewhat linked. They're about sort of education and public services. So I would just invite any responses to those questions, and then we'll come back to the floor.
All right, shall I go first? Yeah, so thinking about what happens to kids in school and whether they go to school or not go to school, which is a really big focus of government at the moment, that drive for attendance. It's worthwhile talking to kids and families about why kids aren't going to school and sometimes why they struggle at school. And, you know, you might not understand why a kid's not showing up, but if you live in a rural area and it's a 10-mile drive and your mum or dad can't afford petrol for the car, that's going to mean that you don't manage to get to school. If you go to school and you know that when you open your lunchbox, you're not really going to have anything there, or you know that you're not going to have like the same shoes as everyone else, or maybe even shoes that fit you at all, that might be a reason why you don't want to go to school. So there is this real focus on government in the opportunity mission that Abby mentioned, that's thinking about how you get more kids going to school and how you sustain that through their school careers. And then I think, you know, the reason for that is understandably to try and reduce inequality when they get older. But I think poverty is a really big driver of that, and I think that if government doesn't address those underlying causes that are stopping kids going to school, that are affecting their behaviour when they're in school, and how they're able to succeed in school, and a lot of that is poverty. I think there's evidence that actually shows like the causal link between poverty and how kids do at school, then you're not going to get very far along that road. And this doesn't quite answer your question, but we do calculations about the cost to the public purse of the impact of poverty, effectively, and we think it's around £50 billion a year, and that's probably a conservative estimate.
I will let you have free rein if whoever wants to go first.
The public services point is definitely very well made. Yeah, of course. I mean that's the other story of the 2010s, wasn't it? Was the cuts to public services, you know, particularly in local governments. And you're right that the conventional ways in which we measure poverty, living standards, and inequality don't capture those. And I was wondering whether today the government might say something about that explicitly, because it's just had a budget where they've put up taxes on people in order to put money back into public services, basically to undo the unrealistic spending forecast they inherited from Jeremy Hunt. And they're doing that explicitly because they think public services need the money more than we do. So I was wondering whether today they might say something, might identify a measure which tries to capture the value of public service to people. I mean, they haven't. Instead, we've got a measure of living standards, which is about income, and we've got various public service targets, right? Of course, one for health and various ones for crime and education and so on. But no, your point is absolutely right. It's a tough academic/economic challenge to value it. But yes, we are missing part of the story if we don't think about public services and how they've changed over the last 15 years. I think the first question as well was, you explain very clearly how, I guess, poverty leads, how poverty can reduce social mobility. A lack of resources means that a child doesn't thrive at school, which means that they grow up to be an adult that's not going to thrive in the labour market, and then we've got a cycle of poverty. Some of us have mentioned the opportunity mission. That's another one of the government's 5 or 6 missions, and that's the one where you might expect it to talk about inequality. As Abby said, people don't spot the link between thinking it's perfectly fine for families to pass their wealth down and, on the one hand, on the other hand, believing in a meritocracy. In the opportunity mission, when the government talked about that today, they did talk about poverty holding back families and children. They did say that. They didn't make the inequality argument that we also need to think about families who've got huge amounts of resources. But they did identify that there is a link between poverty and this so-called opportunity mission. Abby?
Yeah, and I think it's true that now the cabinet is fully state educated. Yes. Which is interesting, and I think you would imagine that would inflect a lot of the way that they think about public services. Just a few additional thoughts. So to kind of flip your question on its head in a way, poverty affects children's life chances, but we've done some work to look at the impact of poverty on kind of some of the more sort of qualitative reflections, it seems like what you guys are quantifying, but to look at how poverty affects public services, looking at GPs and kind of educational sort of teachers and kind of heads of nurseries. And actually what we found is that poverty makes the work of public services like much harder. If you are a school that's having to worry more about creating a food bank than teaching, or if kids are turning up hungry and not able to learn, then that makes your job much harder. If you're a GP and you're in an area, and this is very well documented by Michael Marmot and others, but if you're in an area of higher deprivation, you have much more sort of complex, deep health issues that you are having to contend with, which makes your job harder. So there's this kind of negative spiral between poverty, public services, which is we need to be much better at making the case for tackling poverty. And that sort of bridges to your question. So just one example of, I completely agree with Mike that we need better ways to quantify this, because it is actually, when you ask the public, it's always the top thing that they think is a concern is health. So people we might not be able to value it quantifiably, but we know that there is real political value in fixing public services because people are often thinking about it as their key concern. But just a reflection from some conversations that I had as part of a project I was leading on childcare last year was with local authorities. And local authorities' early years teams have been completely decimated over the last sort of 10, 15 years. And those teams previously would be in charge of maternal sort of postnatal care locally, linking up your Sure Start with your other local services, with your childcare, with your health visitors. And now I spoke to some local authorities where it was like half. I was speaking to one person. She said the early years team is half of me. It's half of one person. And so there's a real poverty that is created through that, right? Like, you don't have services that are there, maybe they're not there at all because they don't have funding, but they're not being joined up, they're not being managed locally, and parents, ultimately low-income parents, will suffer. And so I think we need to do a better job of telling that story. And local authorities, I mean, the LGA, the Local Government Association, I think they're like hoarse with how much they are sort of shouting every sort of quarter with how little money they have because of the cuts to local authorities and public services. But I still don't think we talk about it enough. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Another round of questions, please. So I'll start at the front here.
You've all talked today about the impacts of both wage stagnation and cuts to public services on poverty. And I think a policy that affects both of those is the national insurance increase. Employers are saying that wages are going to have to stagnate because they can't afford the increases, but the state says it's a necessity because there's a black hole in public spending. So my question overall is that tax increase a force of good or a force of bad in regards to poverty?
Question. Can we put hands up again so I can see them all? I'll take this one at the front here.
So I think for a long time, the UK has had like a really broad middle class, but over the recent few years, wealth inequality has become a bigger thing in society. So do you guys believe that a wealth tax would be a viable option? Because other European countries have implemented it successfully, like Spain. And so yeah, that's the question.
So I think with the red jumper at the back there. Yeah.
Yeah. So it was really interesting when you said that stat, that opinion that the IMF came out with about inequality, perhaps hampering growth. I mean, why were you a little bit more hesitant to apply that to a model such as the economy in the UK? And I mean, if there was evidence for that in the UK, why don't politicians jump on that more?
3 excellent questions there. Should we start with national insurance, Mike? I feel like you're probably very well placed to answer that one.
Definitely. Our story about what happened in this budget was that the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, went into it with a set of tax plans and spending plans drawn up by her predecessor, Jeremy Hunt, the Conservative Chancellor, that were just totally unrealistic. And people tried to point this out during the election campaign, and Paul Johnson at the IFS called it a conspiracy of silence and got headlines for that too. But there it is. So in the election campaign, Labour accepted it. When they got into government, they realised, of course they realised, it was unrealistic. So unrealistic set of plans to spend money on public services, which allowed him to do the cuts to national insurance in last year and earlier this year, right? And basically, the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, just corrected that. She said, "That's not realistic. Sorry, public services will collapse completely if we do this. We're going to have to spend more on public services, and we're going to have to tax more." Now, I think it would have been better if she had said, "And therefore, I'm going to undo the tax cuts that Jeremy Hunt has introduced, just directly reverse them." But they didn't do that, right? They pledged in the manifesto they weren't going to increase national insurance, so she had to find this weird workaround. And employer national insurance is basically the other thing you turn to, because it's the only tax really only other tax that's going to raise you the tens of billions that you needed to find. So she had to go there. And we're seeing the sort of aftermath about that. So some of the public sector is protected because the government's putting more money into public services, so they're sort of protected. But of course, we're hearing all the stories about organisations that are not quite public sector, but also not able to increase their prices because they're not selling anything. There might be charities, it might be hospices, might be GPs, might be pharmacists. So there's an awful lot of bodies who are sort of in this grey area that for them, the extra national insurance bill can't come out of profits because they're not making profits. They can't put up their prices to their consumers. They're just going to have to suck it up. So no, not ideal. But I mean, I think I really would stress it is largely because the previous government gave them such a duff inheritance when it comes to the plans for tax and spending, because they were so keen to cut taxes in 2023 and 2024.
Can I just add a small point to that? You talked about those sectors who kind of sit just outside care, and so childcare and social care is a really weird one where not only are they unable, particularly childcare, are they unable to they don't get the kind of payback payoff, but so much of the money that they kind of run on is government subsidies, and then so there's this so it's this quite strange, these peripheral sectors who increasingly, because so many of our public services are delivered by private bodies, private entities, occupy this very strange space, who have found themselves sort of fallen through the hole, and now all the sort of sector WhatsApp groups I'm in, everyone's like, we've written this letter to Rachel Reeves, who wants to sign it? And that's happening across a number of different sectors, but childcare and social care are two really, really big ones, because, there's this hypocrisy of okay, you want us to be a public service increasingly, but you don't treat us like, other public services. So it's a really interesting one.
So let's talk about wealth taxes. So I guess there were a number of tax increases in the budget that did hit people with large amounts of wealth. Do we think that the government should be going further? Should there be, for example, a windfall tax on wealth, or a larger, more comprehensive wealth tax than what we have right now?
I mean, I would start from a position of what do children in poverty need? And they clearly need an increase in the support they receive from the state through social security. Families, we haven't really gone into it, but as Abby has said, actually the state funds a huge amount of childcare support, but a lot of the time families in poverty don't get the full benefit of that because of the way the rules around them operate. If you look at all the things that kids in poverty need, they have to get paid for, and I think that the fact of the matter at the moment is that money has got to come from somewhere, and the reason the government is saying that it might not be able to do all the changes that we think they need to do is because they haven't got enough money. If we want to stop there from being 5 million children living in poverty by the time the next election comes round, government is going to have to spend some money on this. Whether it chooses to spend money that's come from elsewhere, or whether it wants to look at, it said it doesn't want to do additional taxation, but I think you then find yourself in a place where you can't afford to do all the things that you need to do. And that is kind of, I guess, one of the fundamental conundrums that the government is facing right now. But it's really clear that to lift more kids out of poverty, government will have to spend some of the public finances on it.
Just a few additional thoughts on that. So I think one thing we haven't really talked about here is the political situation that the government faces right now, which I think is quite important to think about. You know, what could be quite an unpopular policy like wealth taxes. Like, personally, I think wealth taxes are crucial. I work on care. We are increasingly going to see more and more people living longer. That will increase the sort of burden on the state, and that money's got to come from somewhere. And so personally, I think it's very important. But I think we would, in order to do this properly, we would need to tell a very different story, as I said earlier, about wealth and its relationship to value, its relationship to hard work. And currently, we're not in that place. And the reason I raised the sort of political situation, the current political coalition that the Labour Party holds has been referred to as broad and shallow. And that's because it's pulled together a bunch of different constituencies. It's managed, or the Reform has managed to split the Conservative vote. And so it's quite precarious. When we do sort of opinion polling and public attitudes, we find that Labour is having to dodge a very sort of careful tightrope, sort of walk a very careful tightrope in order to keep its electoral coalition together, and currently doing some work looking at people's views about sort of funding settlements for different kinds of care. And again, things like basically people don't want their inheritance tax, they don't want their council tax to go up. You know, these are the two big wealth taxes that people know about. What they want is a new tax, you know, like a health and social care levy. They want a new tax that's specifically for funding this thing. They want an insurance-based system that is, you know, generating revenue through some kind of new stream. And again, that comes back to people's views about the things that they own, the things they value, the house that they spent their lives, you know, in, and paid off the mortgage. Like these are very deep beliefs about people's identity, their value, their place in the world, their family's place in the world. And I think we would need to tell a very different story in order to be able to do something like that.
Do you want anything, Mike?
Yeah.
I'll do the wealth. Yes, on wealth.
We'll come back to the inequality and growth.
Thank you. On the wealth. I'm not going to answer your question directly, but I guess refer you to the protests and the complaints that we've seen in the UK when the government has made a small change to inheritance tax. Now, yes, as Abby says, people are inordinately attached to their inheritances, so they definitely do spark something. But if we think about what the government's done to farmers, if you're a farmer and you pass away, you can effectively bequeath £3 million tax-free, and people are outraged at the idea that you can only bequeath £3 million. £3 million puts you well in the top 10% of the wealth distribution. So you are definitely not poor if you're in this situation, and yet most people in the country seem to think that's, you know, it's outrageous. You just pay any inheritance tax on that. So, and then the other form of wealth that people are very attached to is their pension. There were rumours in the run-up to the budget that the government might do something to restrict pension tax relief, which are very large and skewed towards higher earning people. And, you know, again, the outrage was enormous. Obviously, this is partly because the media amplifies those voices, but it is also because people feel like, you know, I contribute, you know, I earned this, I saved, I deserve my wealth. So what I take from that is that by all means, please carry on advocating for a wealth tax, because wealth is very unequally distributed. But I think it means, your only hope of success is to advocate for a wealth tax that goes at the very, very top, right? Super, super, super top. Not maybe not above 10 million, but 100, but really, absolute tiny fraction of people paying it. But then, of course, you wouldn't raise much money, and then maybe they'll all move overseas. It's probably worth. There's much more at stake, of course, in the US, where their wealth distribution is even more extremely unequal than ours. I mean, ours is pretty unequal, but it's not as absurdly unequal as you get in the US. But so I think, wealth tax is only really going to work whilst we have a democracy, wealth taxes are only going to work if you go for the very, very wealthy.
And any responses to the question on inequality and growth?
Oh, sorry. Yes, I didn't quite catch the very last bit of what you said.
Well, I just said, if you could apply that what the IMF said about economies like Latin America to the UK, why don't politicians make more of it?
Oh, I see. I think what the IMF found was that the link was particularly strong in Latin American countries, so there's very clear evidence there. It was less clear evidence in European countries or for UK levels of inequality. So I think just the evidence is not quite as strong for the UK as it is for other countries. But yeah, I mean, there was, you raise a good question, and inequality did become more salient in the 2010s, basically. I mean, in 1990s, 2000s, when I was, we didn't talk about inequality. Inequality definitely took off in the 2010s, and was talked about a great deal in the United States, which we know. And they there in the 2010s, politicians from both sides, but particularly obviously mostly Democrats, were very happy to talk about the fact that inequality was bad for growth in the US, and the amount of inequality in the US was a sign that their economy had failed. I mean, we see that a bit less now, I think, in the US as well, in the UK. But there was definitely a time, when whether it was Obama or Mark Carney, who was at one point ran the Bank of England, or various big shot economists were making that argument. They make it a bit less loudly now, and I don't quite know why.
We've just got time for one or two final questions. So any further hands? Yeah, on the left there.
You mentioned that a different political story has to be talked about poverty and inequality, and if this cultural and societal shift is seen as necessary, how do you think should the Labour government approach this change, and how it should be done, or how it can be done? Because history of the UK suggests that this sort of issue with inequality has been a very long-standing one. So how would this be done?
And right at the back.
Yeah, it was just a question really about, not about tax, why not simply extend council tax bans? Because it is outrageous that a house with a value of £11 million in Richmond is paying the same council tax as a house of £320,000. Nice quick win, popular and populist at the same time. But will it raise money?
Great question. We've got about 5 minutes left, so maybe we'll start with the political questions. So it was how do we change the political climate? What could Labour do to do that?
$1 million question, I think. I might just quickly come back on the council tax one, though. I don't think it's very popular, because I think a lot of people would find their council tax bill going up massively. So yeah, it's again.
At the top end, not for the existing. Are you just
well, a lot of people in London.
Put up with 8, introduce more bans. Yeah. We've got A to H.
Yeah.
Why not A to B?
I'm with you. I worked on council tax reform at Citizens Advice. That one of the it's the only bill you can not pay and go to jail for. So I've had lots of sympathy for that. But it's a tricky one. I think it's a bit more tricky than you might be being across. How do you solve the political sort of problem, and how do you tell a different story? I think I'll do one negative, one positive. I think you don't do what the government's been doing in the last couple of weeks, where you demonise people on benefits, because we need to tell a much more positive story about the role of social security. The thing the cost of living crisis taught many of us, the pandemic as well, is that our circumstances can change at any point, and actually sympathy for people on benefits and a kind of general kind of progressive view definitely increased around that time, and now we're seeing opinions go back. So I think if you talk about social security as a public service that we should all be able to rely on, I think that tells a much different story. And then I think we actually maybe I'll stop on that, and if I think of something else, I'll let you know.
What are thoughts on politics?
Okay, very, very quickly. I mean, I think the government obviously it's got a lot of challenges right now, but also, it does have a really big opportunity that it is going to be holding the microphone for the next 4 years. And there obviously are there's a lot of political undercurrents going on. There's lots of shifting sands that they're clearly trying to navigate. But I really wouldn't underestimate the power that you could have spending 5 years talking about why it's worth investing in children and families, trying to explain to people, some of the benefits of that, and really kind of, as Abby says, like building on like the progressive feelings that people have had after that shared sense of how awful things have been for a long time. But I suppose one of the challenges around child poverty that the government faces is that if you take an approach that costs less money but is very means tested, then that is how you'll get the most bang for your buck in how many kids you lift out of poverty for how much you're willing to spend. But that does only speak to a certain group of people, and sometimes government wants to be speaking more widely, even though we think they should be making that bigger case. But then when you say, well, maybe you could extend free school meals to everybody, maybe you could increase child benefit instead of, or in addition to, the child element of universal credit, that comes with a much higher price tag. So I think maybe government needs to make a bit of a decision as well. You know, if it wants to spend the least amount of money possible to lift kids out of poverty, then you need to be able to defend getting rid of difficult policies that seem to be lodged in the public consciousness, like the 2-child limit. You need to explain why you're doing that. Or if you want to not necessarily have that conversation and take a more all-encompassing approach, you need to be willing to explain to the public why you're spending more money in a tax and benefit system. We'll see which way they go.
Do you want anything there, Mike?
Well, the counter to that question, what you could have said to Abby is, what about Wales, where they did introduce more bans and they have revalued, and it seems to have happened without the world collapsing. So why can't England do what happened in Wales? I don't have an answer to that other than the emotive power of council tax and the power of certain newspapers. I also don't know what stories should be told by Labour, but I was using the advantage I have, which is age, to think back to New Labour and what they did. And I think Gordon Brown was able to tell 2 stories. One story was about older people, and one story was about children. And I mean, in the early 2000s, older people really were much poorer than the rest of society, and a lot poorer than they are now. And so at the time, it worked quite well to align older people with poverty. That government did a great deal to increase support for older people, and as a result, and because the Conservatives carried on, we now have relatively low rates of pensioner poverty. So that was one thing that was quite. And then with children, yes, it comes down to money. I'm just repeating what Sara said. The new Labour government was able to. They call it progressive universalism. They did something for everybody and a bit more for the poor. And as a result, they got widespread political and voter buy-in that we should support families with children. And while they were saying that and doing that, kind of sneakily on the side, they were doing more for the poorest. And that's one way they got child poverty down. And this government, as we've alluded to already, just does not feel it has the fiscal space, the money available to do that, and Sara and I know, I think we'll have hints from the conversation we're having with people in government that, well, you said it already, that the government is trying to find the cheapest possible thing it could do to reduce child poverty, but which is fair enough. But of course there are risks to that. It doesn't help you, doesn't help produce a coalition of voters and supporters for that strategy.
Thank you all very much. I'm afraid that we've reached 7:30, the end of our discussion. Can you all join me in saying a very big thank you to all of our panellists for coming on tonight for a very interesting discussion, and thank you all as well.